Lorimer's father was a captain of the French Marine, and the French Marine were garrison troops. They didn't work all the time. They worked when they were needed, and so they were half-pay officers, which meant that they had to do something else with part of their time. And something else that the Lorimers did was fur trade, which worked really, really well for them because the people that they commanded in their military were Indian troops. Okay, so Lorimer was a commander of the Indian troops, and he did fur trade with the Indians. So those occupations went right together. So after the French and Indian War was over, and there were no more French Marines or no more French military in any way in French Canada, it wasn't a huge problem for the Lorimers because what they did was they fell back on their moonlighting job, basically, and were able to become full-time fur traders. That was in 1763. In 1769, when our Lorimer was 21 years old, the Lorimers decided that they would establish a new fur trade post in present-day Western Ohio at a portage. And most of you know what a portage is. If nothing else, you've gone whitewater rafting and you know what a portage is. That's where the water's too low and you have to pick your canoe or your raft or whatever up and carry it from one place to another. Well, if you can imagine in the time period that we're talking about, the big keel boats or pirogues or whatever full of goods, and they had to portage those from one area to another. So the portage where Lorimer established himself was the portage between the Auglaize and the Great Miami Rivers in western Ohio, and that's about 26 miles. So how would you like to have to carry your goods and all the things 26 miles? So Lorimer not only established a trading post, but he established a portage operation. And that portage operation involved men and horses that they would hire out to these people. And so they would meet them at one end of the portage, offer their services, and of course they knew it was going to cost them, and they would transport, ferry, all of these things from the Auglaize to the Great Miami if they were going south, from the Great Miami to the Auglaize if they were going north. And that's the way that Lorimer made his living, in addition to fur trade. He also established a store called, in western Ohio, they still know it today, as the Frenchman's Store. And so Lorimer had this twofold thing that helped him to make a living and get a really, really good start in the fur trade. Lorimer's left his family, of course, to do this. In fact, his father died late in the year 1769, right after the trading post was established. But he had gotten his son Lorimer, Louis, off to a great start because young Louis and his brothers had grown up with the tribes. He had spent a lot of time with the tribes, learning their languages, their cultures, and that kind of thing. And they kind of all moved south and west together. And the relationship between Lorimer and the Shawnee and Delaware in particular, but also some of the other tribes, was a very long-term relationship. Went on for way more than 40, 50 years as they moved from one area to another. Lorimer was actually in the area of Ohio from 1769 to 1782. If you're thinking about your history, you know what was happening in that time period. And that was, of course, the Revolutionary War. Now, Lorimer in the western part of Ohio in that time period pretty much sided with the British. Why? Because the Shawnee sided with the British, the Delaware sided with the British, all the other people in that area that were Indian sided with the British because they knew that if the Americans won, they would cross the Appalachians, flood down the Ohio River, and take off all that land in Ohio, Kentucky area. They knew that would happen. Were they right? Yeah, they were right, because when they won, that is exactly what happened. But that didn't keep them from fighting for their homelands and their way of life. And so that's what they were doing. So Lorimer did side with the Indians, he did side with the British, and he did lose. We know that. In fact, certain historians have said that the last military operation of the American Revolution was in western Ohio, and that was the destruction of Lorimer's store. The very last effort. So the George Rogers Clark brought a contingent of people north of the Ohio. They came up the rivers, they burned the Indian villages, stores, etc. when they got to Lormer's, and it wasn't 1,050 of them at Lormer's, it was about 150 that actually came that far north. But when they got there about 9 o'clock at night. Of course, it was a big surprise. They weren't being expected. They pillaged the store. They burned the store. And the Draper notes, the Draper manuscripts that were put together about 75 years later say that all the sweethearts, wives, and girlfriends of the people on those trips had Lorimer trade silver that they wore for a long, long time. So it was a very successful military operation from the American standpoint. The purpose of it was not just to get back at Lorimer. The purpose of it was to set the stage for all those people coming across the Appalachians and down the river to make the settlement much safer. So with burning out all those Indian tribes in Lorimer and various people in the Ohio Valley, that did make it safer for the settlement that was coming. But of course it was pretty rough on Lorimer and the Indians. That winter of 1782 was a time period when they spent at a place called Wapakoneta, Ohio, and they were trying to kind of regroup. They were doing some trapping so that they could trade for furs, so that they could get trade their furs, so that they could get household goods and so on. They moved then in that next year west to the area around Vincennes, Indiana. Our first journal up here was written on the White River, just west of Vincennes, and it documents the people that Lorimer traded with. It documents the things that they bought. And from looking at it, I think it pretty much confirms the idea that Lorimer was a sub-agent. He was a person who actually wholesaled his goods to other people, and those traders then went out and sold because there's a lot of quantities of goods that he sold in that time period. Things didn't work very well in Vincennes in that time period. It was a very unsettled time. The revolution was just over, and frankly, the American population was outstripping the government. They had run along in front of the government, so there was very little law in this time period, and so that led to some issues. We have some correspondence from Lorimer that talks about some of that.